Today we will be discussing independent travel tips and in particular about my adventures in the Balkans. If you're thinking, Balkans, ooh, scary, war-torn, no way, Jose. I'm asking you to listen and withhold judgment until you hear what I have to say about it and the things that I did. And regardless, you'll still learn some helpful travel tips if you want to travel independently. Once Europe opened up post-COVID in 2021, I wanted to take advantage of there being virtually no crowds, so I hurriedly rescheduled my COVID-postponed Dolomite hiking trip and my Croatian boat and biking tours, which I've since covered those on the show, and I'll put links in the show notes. And since Slovenia is sandwiched between Italy and Croatia, I squeezed in a multi-activity tour there where listener Sharon joined me. I'll put a link to that episode in the show notes as well. So now after Italy, Slovenia, and Croatia, I'm down into the Balkans, and I decided to do an extended exploration of this intriguing region for several months. Remember, this is after I'd sold my house in 2020, and this allowed me to be a carefree vagabond, basically homeless, without worrying about a house, plants, or pets. Today's show, I'm going to focus on traveling in foreign countries without any set plan, which is a different kind of adventure to be sure, as well as what it was like for me to do so traveling solo in a region where I often couldn't even read the signs, since many are in Cyrillic. You'll hear stories of my blunders and mishaps, as well as some of the tricks I use or learn to use to prevent future mishaps. Winston Churchill famously said that the Balkans produce more history than they can consume. And you'll recall that the Bosnian capital of Sarajevo was where a local radical shot the heir to the Austrian-Hungarian throne, which sparked the First World War. Today we're going to explore the beautiful and complicated Balkan states that aren't commonly visited by tourists. I believe that after listening to today's show, you're going to consider adding one or more of these charming, friendly, historical, and I might add super economical European countries to your travel wish list. It was a fantastic adventure, and I can't wait to share it with you. So let's get started. Welcome to the Active Travel Adventures podcast. I'm your host, Kit Parks. Today we'll be talking about how to travel without a plan, along with some of my impressions of the Balkans. After traveling with others for a month when I was in Italy, Slovenia, and Croatia, it was a nice change to fly solo for a while. The Balkans, which many of us get confused with the Baltics, are southeastern European countries. And while sometimes disputed, the Balkans consist of Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, Bulgaria, Greece, Montenegro, Serbia, Kosovo, plus European Turkey. In contrast, the Baltics, which people often confuse, are the northern European countries of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which border the Baltic Sea. And the Baltics are not to be confused with the Stan countries of Central Asia, which many people get those confused, that once made up part of the USSR, like Kazakhstan, Takistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, etc. Are you with me? Ha! It gets really confusing, I know, doesn't it? So the region we're going to focus on is on the other side of the Adriatic Sea from Italy. So picture Italy, the water on the right-hand side of Italy, that's where the Balkans are. It shares a similar climate, the same stunning coastlines, and it definitely has the European flair in architecture because it was once occupied by the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, who did tons of building in the area. But you're also going to see a lot of the Turkish influence from the Ottoman Empire. So it's got cool things to see, and no matter what city you go in, because it's just a collision of cultures. It truly is the crossroads of the whole region. I spent most of my time in the former Yugoslavia, a country formed after World War I and ruled by the dictator Tito, whom today some love and others despise. This region has a very complicated history, and despite taking a history tour in each capital, sometimes I'm still scratching my head trying to understand what the heck happened, especially during the 90s, which saw horrific, barbaric atrocities during the Bosnian War. There are still many remnants of that tragic conflict, and it's been 30 years, and now the region is stable. But you still see signs of a collective PTSD from the citizens, many of whom were children during the war. And because of the war, it has shaped how they look at life. Several that I met devote their lives trying to convey the horror of war so that future generations won't repeat the same mistakes. But there's certainly more to the Balkan states than war, although we will touch on the conflict today. In the Balkans, you can get the full European experience, but at a fraction of the cost of the heavily touristed Western European countries like France and Italy. You'll get to enjoy very similar architecture, loads of festive cafe-lined cobblestone streets selling the freshest of foods, and with delicious wine that's only a few dollars a bottle, and delicious, truly delicious. I felt safe the entire time I was in the Balkans, even wandering around at night in the tourist areas, with one minor exception. I'll describe that later. It was a marvelous experience, and it was truly affordable. Outside of Croatia, which is heavily touristed, I'm talking Dubrovnik and Split there, the rest of Croatia is pretty cheap, I was hard-pressed to spend $50 per day for my food and lodging. And you can't beat that. And this was nice. I was always right in the heart of the old town and ate whatever I wanted. So when I finished my boat and bike tour in Dubrovnik, I had a bit of a dilemma. I wanted to go to Mostar in Bosnia, but the public bus didn't arrive until after dark at 7:30 p.m., which is a no-no for me, as I'm always trying to be checked into my lodging by 4 o'clock. That will allow me to be there in daylight and allow for screw-ups. So as a workaround, I booked a day tour from Dubrovnik to Mostar, which also included a stop at the Kravik Falls, but then I asked my guide, can I be left behind in Mostar when we finished our walking tour around 3 o'clock? And this worked out perfectly, and it was a great way for me to get there. And note that I crossed country borders, so while it was okay to take transport to Bosnia from Croatia, since I paid for the Croatian tour, this technique most likely wouldn't work in reverse. Say I tried to catch a ride on the back side of the same tour from Mostar to get to Dubrovnik. The Bosnian government would be unhappy that they did not get the tax money for the Croatian-based tour, because Croatia did, so I might have problems at the border. The fact that Croatia dumped a tourist onto Bosnian soil, where I'd then be generating tax revenue for Bosnia, was of course no problem. And my guide was certain to correct my pronunciation of Bosnia. It's Bosnia-Herzegovina, not Herzegovina. Emphasis on the Herz, the first syllable. Most people just shorten it to say Bosnia. When I hear Bosnia, until my trip, I used to think war. But of course Bosnia, like all the Balkan states, are more than war, although there is a lot of war tourism here. And like I said, it's been around 30 years since all the troubles, so the region is completely different now. Here, in addition to traditional Western architecture, there's also amazing Byzantine and Ottoman buildings. As mentioned, the Balkans are at the crossroads of the East and West, and were strategically important for trade and power. So if you're a history buff, you are going to be on maximum overload. I discussed some of the war history in the Croatia episode, but to go a bit deeper, in this region there are 4 religious groups, basically found in most of the states but in different proportions. The Orthodox Christians, these are the Serbian people. The Catholics, these are the Croatians. The Muslims, these are the Bosniaks, and others. That includes everybody else, including Jews and atheists. Unlike most countries where you can often tell by looking at somebody what religion they are, here everybody looks the same, dresses the same, speaks the same language, and can live and work wherever they want. In Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia, they once had a large Jewish population, but unlike most of Europe, they were, until the Nazis arrived, always allowed to work and live wherever they wanted. There never was a Jewish ghetto here. In fact, one of the largest Jewish cemeteries in Europe is here. The Albanians proudly never turned their Jews over to the Nazis. In Mostar, Bosnia, just a short walking distance in, you're going to find a remaining Jewish temple, many mosques, and several impressive Orthodox and Catholic churches. When the Ottomans arrived in the 1450s, post-Byzantine era, and this was the eastern province of the Roman Empire, they brought with them Islam. But get this, it was the Islamic leader who invited the Jews being forced out of Spain later that century to move to Sarajevo, where they could practice their religion in peace and be part of Sarajevo's golden era of prosperity. So outside of some egregious periods, the people here pride themselves on how everybody gets along. Sarajevo prides itself on being a city where all people can come together, and even painted on the main pedestrian drag it says, Sarajevo, meeting of cultures, in huge letters. But in Bosnia, when things went bad, they went very, very bad. Fueled, from what I can tell, by the leaders pushing people to define themselves by their religion rather than their country. Like many conflicts in the world, The different people got along fine until the politicians riled them up to find an enemy in their neighbor. The Orthodox, the Catholics, and the Muslims had gotten along just fine until radical separatism seeped in. My guide to some of Mostar's area charms says he considers himself a Bosnian first and then a Muslim, and I would bet most feel the same. During the 1990s Bosnian War in Mostar, the Bosnian Serbs, the Orthodox, sought to remove the Bosnian Muslims, and horrible fighting ensued. Here the Bosniaks and Croats worked together to fight the Serbs, but in other parts, these two groups would fight each other. Like I said, it's really, really complicated. And as you walk around the city decades later, you still see signs of war. You'll see stone buildings racked with mortar shells, some missing roofs where large trees now emerge from the broken windows. The saddest thing I saw was a film about the fall of the famous Mostar Old Bridge, caught on tape. I took the city tour, that's how I got there, and my tour guide was 11 years old during the war, and he actually worked as a translator, and he had taken this footage. He now owns a bookstore and shows this raw footage in his store at the base on the Muslim side of the old bridge. And if you go, I encourage you to stop by and take a look. I'll put a link in the show notes. It's been fascinating to hear each country's side of the story. And as is often the case, after a walking tour, I take the guide to lunch. This is one of my little tricks. They think they're getting a treat of a free lunch out, which of course they are, but I get the better end of the deal because I get to pick the brain of a knowledgeable, English-speaking local. So I encourage you to do that. The remarkable Mostar High Arch Bridge was built in the 1500s out of limestone, and it's the pride of the city. But during the war, it was purposely destroyed to lower the morale of the Bosniaks. The bridge has been rebuilt using the same handmade techniques in limestone and is once again the star of Mostar. I'll put a picture on the website at activetraveladventures.com. Mostar's Old Town is charming and filled with restaurants and cafes, plus an abundance of wares for sale. And it's super affordable. I like to keep my podcast evergreen, meaning I don't want to put in prices and things that will change over time, but just to give you an example to showcase how inexpensive most of the Balkan states are, I had a lovely Airbnb right in the heart of Old Town, and I paid under $35 a night for it. Now, it was a studio apartment with no kitchen. I did have a refrigerator, but a fine full restaurant meal cost me maybe $15, and that included 1 or 2 beers, and usually it was enough for 2 meals, so I could bring leftovers and have that as a snack or lunch later. Coffee ran about $1. So not counting any day tours or transportation, I was living for about $50 a day. There's no way I can do that at home. And this is in one of the most popular tourist areas in Bosnia. And Old Town is simply charming with its heavily cobbled streets. The main drag is lined with interesting shops for tourists, of course, but I see many things I would have liked to buy, but there was just simply no room in my backpack. The crystal green river Neretva bisects the city. It's one of the Red Bull high diving competition sites, and sometimes you'll see people jumping from the bridge, which is close to 100 feet tall. I try to stay when I travel independently about 5 days in a place. You don't need that long to explore Mostar, but you'll feel less like a tourist when the locals start recognizing you and smiling at you, chatting with you, especially if you repeat, say, going to the same gelato place every day or the same coffee shop every day. I thoroughly enjoyed a day tour out of Mostar, and I used iTravel, who also happened to be my Airbnb host. I'll put a link to them in the show notes as well. The first stop on our day tour was one of my favorites, to Blaj. Here you'll find a former 1470 monastery built into a huge cliffed mountain where the river Buna rushes from its base. This cliffside is so tall I couldn't fit it in a single photo from the base of the mountain, so I'll put a beautiful video on the website. Open-air cafes line the river, giving you a wonderful view of the monastery, mountain, and river. Our guide explained how the Muslims whirling dervishes would turn and turn and turn until they got into a deep meditative state. They also offered counsel to their members on the very seats we sat on in the surrounding dance area. A sobering reminder in that same room is a full-scale coffin-shaped indentation in the wall to remind us that we can't take it with us. Our guide, like every guide I meet in the Balkans, tries to explain how complicated his country is. There's a public phone on the right, and the receiver is completely busted, and apparently it's been that way for ages and will remain so. Across from the broken phone booth is a halal restaurant that serves beer. Halal means meat prepared according to Muslim law, yet beer is against Muslim law. So the guy was trying to explain there's just complications and contradictions everywhere in his culture. While much of the population is Muslim, few women cover their heads unless they're entering a mosque. I see no signs of anything like you hear of Sharia law. Women are out and about freely, and I feel perfectly comfortable, and no one pays me any mind that I travel and eat out solo. From the Muslim monastery, we head to an Orthodox church, the frescoes on the top of which had to be rebuilt after the war. Yet here, you'll see a feature that's a little bit heresy. Prior to conversion, there were those that had animalism beliefs. So unlike a traditional Orthodox church, on some of the columns are carved pictures of hunters and animals that are not allowed in the prescribed tradition today. The vineyards across the way are now maintained by others, as there's only around 8 monks living at the monastery now. Our next stop is the historic open-air museum and village of Positelji. I know I misspelled that. It started as a fortress with traditional stone walls during the medieval period, but when the Ottomans arrived, they liked it and they built houses inside, many of which remain today. It makes for a charming walk through these historic alleyways. I think Moran said 18 families still live there, and the pomegranates and the mandarins were ripe, so we enjoyed pomegranate juice, and I gorged on mandarins for lunch. You can climb the watchtower to see the Neretva River down below and get a beautiful panoramic view of the mountains and valley. However, the clock tower is sadly missing its bell as the former Yugoslavian army took it to melt it down for bullets. It sure was a fun and informative tour, and one I recommend. On my last day in Mostar, I decided to wander the residential areas, trying to get in a nice long walk and go see the raved-about street art. The street art was first class, and I took lots of pictures. It seems most cities have a street art scene these days, and I try to check it out on my travels. Then I headed to a large green area that I assumed would be a park. En route along the sidewalk, I passed an older woman, presumably her daughter and the dog out for a walk. We exchanged pleasantries as I passed, since I walked much faster. About 10 minutes later, I run into them again, and I'd walked at least a half a mile. I pantomime and teased them that they took a shortcut, which they got a kick out of. The daughter could speak English and translated for her mother, who seemed fascinated to see me, as she kept smiling and touching my shoulder as we chatted. I continued up the walk, only to turn around 10 minutes later to run into them again. And again, the old woman seemed delighted to see me, and she was finally now rubbing my upper arm. It's these kind of local personal exchanges that are my favorite part of travel. The park was a forested area with footpaths, mostly made by locals getting to and fro and for jogging and walking their dogs. I had been warned to only stay on well-trodden paths, as sadly there are still unmarked mines that go off in the Balkans and maim people each year. So it's very important to A, stay on regular paths, and only go hiking in the mountains with a guide who will take you to areas without mines. A jogger came towards me, and the path was skinny. I leaned out of the way, keeping my feet securely on the path. I'm sure I was being overly careful, but I noted that the local did the same. I don't want to scare you. It's very safe in Bosnia, Croatia, Slovenia, all the places I went. And of course in tourist areas you need to watch for pickpockets like you do everywhere. But it's safe to be out at night, and crime is not much of an issue from what I've been told by locals. 100% of the locals told me not to worry, and I trust them. They want you to enjoy their city safely, and they would warn you where not to go. After Mostar, I caught an early train to Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia. I'm here during a rainy patch. There's a year-round average precipitation of around 25%, with June being close to 30. The temperatures are slightly warmer than normal, but it'll soon drop down to the 40s during the day, and that's Fahrenheit, and get freezing at night. But I am here for peak foliage season, which is lovely, but unfortunately the rain is speeding up the leaf fall. Throughout the Balkans, I find taking the public bus an easy and affordable way to get around. I use either the Amio or the Rome to Rio app to get an idea of the bus schedules, but then I usually go down to the station a day before to buy or at least double check the schedule to make sure. 95% or more of the time the schedule on the apps are correct, but every once in a while it's wrong, And so it's super important just to make sure it takes some of the stress off of you. This also, by knowing where the station is, ensures I know where to go so I don't get frazzled trying to catch my bus or train. Of all the various things you need to figure out when traveling, I find sorting out the public transit the most stressful, so I do try to put in safeguards like this to minimize my problems and stress. And while this happened much later in my trip, after I'd been in the Balkans for months, I was getting a little confident, maybe too confident in my traveling abilities, and I broke the check the day ahead rule. Here's what happened. I was finishing up North Macedonia and I wanted to go to Albania. Looking at the bus schedule on the app, I could catch a 5 a.m. bus from Bitola, where I was, or I could head to the lakeside resort town of Ohrid near the Albanian border and catch the 9 o'clock bus instead. So I'd save myself that 4 hours that I'd be on the bus. I could be sleeping, have coffee, and just waking up, etc. So I booked an Airbnb in Ohrid for a couple of nights so I could explore the lake town and then enter Albania on a civilized bus schedule. When I checked in Ohrid, the Airbnb owner asked my future plans, and I said I'd be taking the bus to Tirana, the capital of Albania. He asked if I was on the 9 o'clock, and I said yes. He said no problem, he would drop me off. I was like, wonderful, this is great. And since he did mention the time, the exact time of the bus I was planning on going, I broke my rule and I didn't go down to the station to buy my ticket the day before as I normally would. So 2 mornings later, this nice man drives me to the bus station, where we find out that since this is a resort town and it's winter, there are no visitors in the town but me, and there's no bus until the spring. Yikes, I'm in the wrong country. Fortunately, my driver Airbnb host is still with me there, and he calls over a taxi driver. The guy says it's going to be €150. Ouch! I think it was going to be like $4 or something if I'd taken the bus. I'd purposely used up all of my foreign currency so I wouldn't get stuck with it. So I was just down to €25 that I had left over from being in the EU. And I didn't want to pay that much for a ride unless that was my only option. And I'd consider that my stupid tax. I asked if there's any other ideas these guys had. So the 2 drivers are conferring back and forth, and they came up with a plan. For €20, the taxi driver would take me across the border into Albania, where I could then catch the local bus up to Tirana. Let's go. I said, this is great. And I figured if I was uncomfortable in any way, I could always cough up the €150. So after a short drive, my taxi pulls to the side of the road out in the middle of nowhere, along the highway, hardly any vehicles, and he hurriedly gets out of the car. I'm like, there's no way I'm going to be left here. Absolutely not. So I'm trying to get his attention. He's like, no. I want him to take me all the way to Tirana. There he is pulling my backpack out of the trunk, and he doesn't hear me. So I get out of the cab and see why he's so hurried. Up comes the bus, pulling up to this little roadside nothing, and the driver is opening the door for me to enter. So I pantomime, how much? And he goes, €5. Yes, there is a God. As I say a thankful prayer, wave off my kindly cab driver hero who saved the day, and now I have Zippo money, but I figure I can restock at an ATM in Tirana. And I sit down and enjoy my ride to Tirana. So it all worked out well, makes a great story, but always try to check at least the day in advance so you don't run into that frantic little adventure yourself. So my memo to self, stick to my rules in the future. It did make a funny story, but it's unnecessary stress. And speaking of money, in most cases in Europe and Asia, but not necessarily in South America, ATMs will give you the best exchange rate. I pack a debit card from a bank that I keep funded somewhere around $500, and I fund that account with another account where I can transfer funds directly online. This way, if I should ever get held up, the most the bad guy can get from me is whatever the balance is in my ATM bank, which is going to be no more than $500. Credit cards will offer protection, but you don't get that protection with a debit card. And also credit cards I try to use for purchases whenever possible, but in lots of places in the world, you have to have cash. And I don't like to carry a lot of cash. Be sure to bring one that offers no foreign transaction fee. This system allows me to most safely use my debit card. And speaking of crime, if I'm in a city where I worry about pickpockets, I separate my money into 3 places. I keep less than $20 handy, and I call that my pickpocket money, something that it's going to be the area the pickpocket's generally going to go for. But should I get robbed, and he wants to know where my real money is, I have a bit more in a separate place along with a credit card. and then hidden against my body, tucked either in my underclothes with a money pouch, or I sewed a hidden pocket on my cami. That's where I keep my serious money, a backup debit card, credit cards, and my passport. If they find that, I have got much bigger problems than worrying about my money or ID. Gratefully, in all the places I've been, I've never been a victim of crime. I do try to be smart, I try to be aware of my surroundings, and I try to look confident even when I'm not, so I don't come across as weak and a potential target. It's a good idea before you go to another country, whether you're a U.S. citizen or not, to check with the U.S. State Department website for the country you're visiting so you get to know what the current popular scams are in the regions you're visiting. In some places, the crooks like to spill something on you to distract you, while another one is picking your pocket. Others will bump you. On all the travel planners for every adventure I cover on this show, I put a link to this helpful information for you. Like I said, even if you're not a U.S. citizen, it's still helpful information as long as you can read English. And don't forget, if you are on my newsletter travel planner subscriber list, you get access to all of the travel planners I've ever done for this program by just getting that one monthly email from me. You can sign up at activetraveladventures.com/newsletter, or just send me an email at kit@activetraveladventures.com, and I'm happy to put you on the list and give you access. You can unsubscribe at any time. I don't spam you. I don't sell your information. It's just a way for us to communicate back and forth. After you get a welcome email, you just get that single email each month. That's it. And I think you'll find it helpful. So now let's get back to Sarajevo. Here I take an excellent tip-based free walking tour of the city with Adid. I'll put a link in the show notes. Adid's carefully crafted tour gives you a great overview of the history of the city that he brings to life with fantastic storytelling. After the tour, I visit the Jewish cemetery and a haunting children's story museum where people who were kids during the war tell their stories. It was very moving. Since I don't like doing a lot of travel planning, and I know that sounds very odd for a travel podcaster, I love to travel, I just don't like to do the logistics. I don't like figuring out all that stuff. I don't like to spend all that time on the computer. I'd rather just push the buy button, especially for an adventure tour where logistical planning is critical and also hard, especially for a solo traveler, and I think it's safer too. But in the cities, what I tend to do is I just take one of these tip-based walking tours. Then I'll often just go to the souvenir shops and flip through the postcards and make a mental note of all the places I want to see. And after that, I just get lost and people watch. And one thing I do to make sure that no matter how lost I get, I can always find my way back home or to my lodging is that right after I drop my backpack, I pin my location to my map app. That way, no matter how lost I get, I can always find my way home without using data. If you stay in a hotel, you can always grab a business card, but at least write down or take a screenshot of the address that you can show a cabbie should you just can't walk anymore or you just can't find it anymore. Also in my day pack, I'm always carrying a rain jacket because the weather forecasts are never predictable, and it's nice just for that little extra layer, and in case it rains, some snacks and my water bottle. And in every country except Albania in the Balkans, I was comfortable drinking the tap water. I hate those single-use water bottles, so I use a water bottle with a filter whenever I can't drink the tap water, and I'll put a link to that on the show notes as well. This saves all that wasted plastic, saves you a lot of money, even though bottled water is pretty cheap. If you're traveling, you go through a ton of water. And this way, saves you money, saves the planet. It makes me feel better using my filter. In Sarajevo, on some of the bombed buildings, when mortars had bombarded the buildings and carved out some little dings and ruts in the concrete, in the scars, they will either put resin or paint them red in many places. There are over 200 throughout the city, and these indicate where at least 3 people were killed during the siege of Sarajevo in the 90s, which was a prolonged blockade. They call them Sarajevo roses, and they keep them maintained so people don't forget. One odd thing I like to do when I visit foreign countries is to visit graveyards to see how the different cultures honor their deceased loved ones. It was mind-numbing to see row upon row of white crosses like you're visiting Arlington Cemetery, but the vast majority of those in this cemetery die between 92 and 95. Heartbreaking. While Bosnia has moved on, the people are naturally still traumatized and reminders of war remain. They want people to remember in hopes that it will never happen again. After Bosnia, I headed across the border to Serbia. And since I also want to visit Kosovo, which is not recognized as a separate country from Serbia, they still claim it as part of their country, even though Kosovo says that they declared independence in 90, I believe it was. It's important that you go to Serbia first if you want to do both, because they won't let you into Serbia if you've got a Kosovo passport stamp. In fact, one of my travel friends, Victor, who I met in the Galapagos last winter, just posted on Facebook this week that when he got to the Serbian border, he wasn't familiar with this, and they refused him entry, made him turn around once they saw that Kosovo stamp. At the time of this recording in 2023, only Greece, Slovenia, Bulgaria, Romania, and Croatia are members of the EU. So in all the other Balkan states, you must show your passport to enter. I spent a week or so in the capital of Belgrade and visited yet another fortress. I need to count how many castles and fortresses I've visited in the Balkans. They're everywhere. The Belgrade one, at the confluence of the Danube and the Sava rivers, was an extremely important one to the Romans, the Byzantines, the Ottomans, and the Serbian and Austrian empires. It's just a great central location. Outside the impressive fortress is the massive Kalemegdan Park, which is fun to wander around. It's filled with sculptures and families having fun. On the city walking tour, I meet Vishal from India. He's half my age, but we connected and ended up having lunch together. In fact, we still keep up as he travels the world. And speaking of eating, let's talk about Balkan food. It's tasty, it's plentiful, but it is seriously heavy on the red meat. One of the most popular dishes is a meat platter that I'm going to say has like a half a dozen different kinds of meats on it, all grilled. Each portion itself is meal-worthy all by itself. Plus it's got French fries. Almost every dish has got French fries, and occasionally grilled vegetables, although not as many vegetables as I would like to see. After several months, I am starved for non-potato vegetables and a salad. And since I usually rent Airbnbs, often with a kitchen, I do have more access than most travelers to fresh veggies, but I think a vegetarian would have a pretty hard time in the Balkans, I think, unless they really work at it. By the sea, of course, you can get fish and octopus, and I can highly recommend the black ink squid risotto. It is yummy, even though it's unpalatably black to me when you first take a look at it. One bite, you don't care. It's delicious. I visited Serbia for two reasons. I wanted to hear their side of the story, and I also wanted to see the long-eared owls that overwinter in a village called Kikinda. So after Belgrade, I hopped the bus to spend a couple of nights looking for owls. This was easier than I thought. These migratory owls, for some reason, like this little grassy church ground right outside my hotel. I was there a little bit early, maybe like a month or so before the peak of the owls are there, which is mid-December if you want to time it, and I was there in early November. And these owls start heading north again sometime in January, so like that mid-December to Christmas is going to be the best time if you want to go see the owls. Some years they have as many as 1,500 owls in this town. I saw a couple dozen, and I was thrilled. I think I'd only seen owls in the wild once before in my life. To find them, I learned to look for their little poop clusters under the trees under where they perched. Then my eyes would adjust after seeing a dark mound and see, oh, that is an owl. I thought it was very cool, and I thought it was worth the trip. Most people may not, particularly for a couple dozen owls, but I thought it was cool. The town of Kikinda didn't have a whole lot going for it that made it different than other towns, although they did have a really nice fountain of parents playing with their child, tossing the kid in the air. And I have a great photo of the sun just making all the droplets glisten. That's one of my favorites from the whole trip. I'll put it on the website. And they also had some nice street art up and down the main drag. From Kikinda, I headed to Novi Sad in Serbia on the banks of the Danube River. Winter is not the time to visit the city, as all the waterfront restaurants were closed. It looked like it would be quite the happening place in season. I thus cut short my stay and decided I needed to hike. Enough of culture and war for a while. I booked a week's stay in a spa lodge near the Fruška Gora National Park. All right, so I didn't do my homework. I get there, the hotel knows nothing about the national park. It's like 6 miles away, but they're like, no, we're a spa, we don't do hikes. And the town didn't have cabs, or if it did have cabs, I was worried if I took the cab the 6 miles and then hiked, and then there's no cabs to take me home. I was in trouble, and I probably wouldn't have cell service, and I didn't feel like walking 6 miles hiking and walking 6 miles back, so I ended up making my hiking week a spa week and working on this podcast. That's for not doing my homework. I suppose I could have rented a car, but it's the Cyrillic alphabet. I wouldn't even know what the sign said. I wouldn't know if I should stop or go, and that was too twitchy for me. So I just coughed it up and chalked it up as a lesson to do a little bit more homework whenever I want to particularly hike or do something adventuresome, because logistics are always my bugaboo when I'm traveling by myself. That's why I prefer the tours. The next place I visited had a very creepy history. Nice, N-I-S, and it's got a funny little gizmo over the I. A lot of blood has been shed here, 2 periods in particular. First up, the local Serbs were battling the Turks, but were outnumbered 4,000 to 10,000. Once conquered, the Turkish commander ordered his troops to scalp the Serbian soldiers and then fill the scalps with cotton so he could send them to the Sultan in Constantinople to prove his victory. Then, even more morbidly, he ordered that a tower be built with the skulls. The haunting remains of Skull Tower is now covered by a church to preserve the remaining skulls and its memory. Then over on the big hill is the Bubanji Memorial Park, memorializing the more than 10,000 Serbians executed during World War II, many of whom participated in the Great Escape of the Red Cross concentration camp. During the escape, 105 managed to actually escape, 42 died during the escape, and then the guards shot 800 more, and for good measure, another almost 10,000 people. During the war, somewhere between 10 and 12,000, they don't know the exact number, were shot here, so this is a memorial to them. At the top of the hill are 3 massive, defiant, abstract fists that 2 years later, I can still see them in my mind with perfect clarity. To reach the fists, you walk through a forest where the partisans fought for their freedom, and then you take the half-a-mile memorial path to the 60-foot centerpiece marble monolith, I guess you'd call it. It's a relief with 5 compositions that symbolize the killing machine, the execution and firing squads, the civil revolts, the surrender of the German invaders, and their final victory over the oppressors. And at the top of the hill are these concrete obelisk fists, these clenched fists that represent men's, women, and children's hands that defied the enemy, symbolic of the fact that entire families were killed here. It's very powerful and moving. But modern Nice is not all horror and war. It has a charming, lovely, and lively market area. There are plenty of cafes to sit and people watch. There's charming shops to stock up on souvenirs. A favorite sculpture is of 2 bronze life-size men enjoying a chat and a drink, while the Labrador sitting down below the table is looking up hopefully for a treat or a pat on the head. On one day of wandering, I saw, or rather smelled, the aroma of spit roasted pig, and I followed my nose and saw it through an opening in a small courtyard. Obviously it wasn't finished cooking yet, so I decided I would eat my dinner there later and pin the location so I could find it again. Around dinner time, I head down to eat my pig dinner, which is now off the spit, so obviously my timing's good. I wander into the courtyard. It has several picnic tables, but I'm probably early for dinner. And I poke my head in the doorway, indicating that I would like to have a roasted pig dinner. After some confusion with my pantomime, the man goes and gets a woman, and they talk. The woman ushers me inside instead of to the picnic table. So I'm sitting down in the kitchen, and she feeds me dinner. It was delicious. But it wasn't until much later that I laughed and realized I wasn't at a restaurant, I was at somebody's home. And they didn't correct my misunderstanding that they weren't a restaurant, they just fed the confused traveler. Charged me a couple dollars, and I was on my way after having an excellent meal. That reminds me of the time my girlfriend Els and I were on a small street in Bangkok shopping for a long-sleeve shirt so Els could come into the palace. She was not dressed modestly enough. It turns out we were sifting through some woman's clothes that were out on her clothesline. Her clothesline looked like it could have been kind of like a display rack. I'll bet that lady's still laughing at us. In our defense, like I said, it did look more like it could have been a display rack than a traditional clothesline. I found Serbia haunting, and outside of the owls, it's going to leave you hating man's ability to be cruel to men. The memorials are definitely not for the faint of heart. So it was good to have some comic relief, as my next stop was North Macedonia. They like to call themselves Macedonia, but the Greeks have a Macedonia, so they insisted that North Macedonia add that north to their name. My bus arrived in the late afternoon. I was tired. Instead of taking a cab, and I have to say I hate taking cabs because I don't like how no one in the whole world knows that I got into that particular cab with a stranger. So if I'm going to take a cab-like thing, I usually prefer Uber or Lyft, so at least there's a record. But generally, I prefer to walk, and I get a little bit of exercise, particularly after being cooped up on a bus or a train. So I arrive in the capital city of Skopje after a bit before dusk, and the light is very pretty along the river walk as I get to my lodging. I remember being impressed that unlike other cities around the world, Macedonia seems to have got it on. They pressure washed their public buildings. That was noticeable. They glistened. They were glowing in the late afternoon sun. I also noticed that they're really into statues, but I don't think any more of these observations until the next morning. I take a terrific walking tour, and here's where I get my belly laugh. It tells me the reason the buildings are so white is because back when they got rid of the communism and now they are a parliamentary democracy and they're going to open their world. Albania used to be a very, very closed society. U.S. citizens and many were not allowed to even visit it. So it's only been in the last not even 30 years that the country's been open for tourism. So they decide we're going to go after this tourism. But they have these ugly communist buildings. And so who wants to come look at these ugly buildings? So they're going to make the city look pretty. And they have this nice river, but the buildings are the typical drab communist buildings. So they get this idea, a really bright idea. They're going to glue styrofoam architectural features to the buildings to make them look grand. And grand looking they are, until the glue wears off and a chunk of plastic falls down to the ground. Sometimes it goes back up and sometimes it doesn't. They also thought it'd be a great idea to put up some statues and sculptures to show that they've got culture. Then they got the really bright idea, since, statues, they're art. It's really hard to appraise art. These buyers could earn some significant kickbacks from the sculptures. Thus, the statues started appearing like mushrooms after a storm cloud. When I say they have statues everywhere, I literally mean everywhere. I counted 40 on just one of the bridges crossing the Vardar River, and that's maybe 300 feet across. From one vantage point, I counted, just standing in one place, 100 statues in my view. Statues not only line the many crossover bridges, but also they dot the tops of the buildings. Squares are going to have numerous statues, and many, many are supersized. The locals hate it, and they resent that the debt created to finance what they consider a monstrosity will be carried by their grandchildren's grandchildren. Like I said, I thought it was funny, even though it was a little bit sad. And the building sure did look clean because when it rains, it washes off all the dirt. It's plastic. And so I can't recommend making a special trip to North Macedonia. I must say, out of all the places I visited, the memory of Skopje and that guide telling us about the styrofoam buildings and the statues makes me laugh to this day. One other important part of Macedonia is they, along with Albania, claim Mother Teresa as their own. She was born here in Skopje in 1910, and since she's Albanian descent, the Albanians claim her as well. And in Skopje, I did have one of my favorite meals, lamb under the bell. This actually is a very popular dish in Croatia. Apparently it's popular down here as well. Lamb under the bell is a roasted lamb cooked with potatoes and vegetables, and it is yummy. By this time, I've been on the road for months and months, and I've been in an area without many tourists due to it being in the off-season, plus COVID was scaring away tourists. So often, unless I was talking to a tour guide, I just talked to myself or inside my head for days on end. I was up above on a fortress, and I heard somebody speaking English down at the ticket office. I could understand them. I hollered down, "You speak English?" He said yes, and that's how I met Ronaldo. He's a man from El Salvador who's traveling the world. We toured the fortress together and had lunch afterwards, and now we still keep up via Facebook. That man hasn't stopped yet, and I enjoy following all of his escapades. Love or hate Facebook, it is my favorite way to keep up with the people I meet on the road because It's not like we be emailing or texting back and forth all the time, but this way we do get to keep up, and every once in a while we can cross paths again. Since I've already been to Serbia, it's now okay for me to enter Kosovo, which is my next stop. I head to the capital of Pristina. Getting there is the one odd time where I think I almost got myself into trouble. The bus there was a small van, maybe 4 or 5 of us on it, and that's fine. Usually a bus goes to a main city terminal, but sometimes it'll make a couple of stops in a city, and this was the capital, so I assumed it'd be bigger. Before putting my phone into airplane mode, I put the directions to my lodging on the phone, put it in airplane mode, then that I can still track where I am offline, and then I'll hopefully get off at a stop that's near my lodging. And as I see we're closing into the city, and then it looks like we're going to bypass it. So I'm like, well, maybe, the bus terminal's on the other side and it's easier to go that way. So I don't think that much about it. But then it looks like we're veering away from the city. My driver doesn't speak English, but I make it clear, I went out. Something's wrong. I didn't know what was going on, but it didn't look like we're going to the city I bought my ticket for. And there was a lady on the van who spoke a little bit of broken English. And she's like, how about I'll call a taxi and we'll take it downtown together. She wasn't even indicating that she wanted to go downtown. So I was like, I don't know what the heck's going on here. But I was getting bad vibes about the whole situation. And for all I knew, she was calling an accessory to rob me. And I don't know. So I just thanked everybody and just got out of the car. And it was maybe like a 3-mile walk to downtown to my Airbnb. The whole thing was very strange. And maybe everybody was being nice and maybe there's a misunderstanding. But I still think I made the right call. I believe that, especially when traveling, listen to your intuition, and most definitely, if you ever get those hairs in the back of your neck, do whatever is making you nervous. Make a racket. Get the heck out of there. Because sometimes your brain's going to pick up things you don't realize at the time. And something was just telling me, this is wrong. Something's not right. I'm not going to help. Often I'll accept the help of a stranger, but it wasn't normal the way she was acting to help me. And she may very well have been taking pity on me. But then again, maybe not. Maybe she was taking advantage. I don't know. It was weird. So as I'm walking to town, I come across a huge bronze statue of Bill Clinton. Kosovo, I must tell you, loves the United States, and in particular Bill Clinton, because of all of our help during the 90s. And they love Hillary too. In fact, there's a pantsuit boutique devoted to Hillary's iconic pantsuits. When I think of Kosovo, I have several main memories besides that weird arrival. They have a massive national and university library with a really unusual architecture that they refer to as a new regionalism. It's a combination of cubes and domes, and it looks like it has an exoskeleton outside of the building. I can't say I particularly like the outside very much, but it's a wonderful library on the inside. And then they have a memorial made up of over 20,000 brass medallions forming the face of a proud woman. Each of these medals or medallions symbolizes the more than 20,000 women who were raped during the war. And you know how when you go to a tourist city, you'll often find they spell out the name of the city in big, colorful capital letters so you can take a picture of yourself in front of it? Right, I think it was like right across from this woman's memorial, there's huge letters spelling newborn. And it was decorated with colorful handprints of children. When I saw it, I thought it meant that the city was rising from the ashes of war and they were newly born. But what it actually symbolizes is Kosovo's declaration of independence from Serbia, which, as I mentioned, Serbia still disputes. And I did find out when I did a little research that each year they changed the declaration out front. So while it was handprints when I was there, who knows what it is this year. Also, I visited a museum that showcased traditional living and the traditional home. Not that anybody in the city lives that way anymore, maybe more so in the country, you might still find some. But in the city, it looks pretty modern. In a traditional home, however, there's 2 main sections. One is a public area with several low wooden chairs surrounded by a low, wide circular table where everybody could eat, drink, and just chat and catch up. And here's the interesting thing. Any traveler passing through was welcome to stay in these public rooms. The private side of the house was strictly for family. The decor throughout is heavily decorated with these deep garnet red rugs, patterned red rugs, with very, very elaborately carved wooden ceilings filled with rosettes and flora, very intricate, beautiful, beautiful woodwork. The furniture, everything, beautiful carving. I was really impressed by their hospitality culture of leaving their door open so a complete stranger could sleep at their house when passing through. That's amazing. Kosovo is 95% Muslim, with just a smattering of Catholic and Serbian Orthodox. I have found that Muslim countries in general share that hospitality culture more so than most other places I've been. In Kosovo, despite being a Muslim country, they have a large, beautiful Catholic cathedral dedicated to Mother Teresa. And I believe I've read it was the first cathedral ever dedicated to her. And I want to make note too, in none of the Muslim areas of my Balkan visit was there a need for me to cover my hair or face. Of course, I would always do so if I was going into a mosque and often a cathedral. And whenever I travel, I always dress modestly anyway, and I encourage you to do the same. Women in particular need to cover their shoulders and arms as considered respectful. Don't wear short shorts or tank tops. I always carry in my backpack a lightweight scarf just to cover my head should I need it, and also adds a little warmth if you need it that way too. I try to respect the local culture. After a brief stay in Kosovo, I returned to North Macedonia to explore some more. In Prizren, I see tree trunks artfully decorated with colorful crocheted wrap, like those old crochet Afghans, except they're going around the tree trunks. I think it was just for decoration, because some look like they've been on the tree for a while, not like they were put up just for a special holiday that I didn't see. In Prizren, they have a really nice fortress which offers a great view of the city down below. You can see all of the mosque minarets, but also a bunch of churches. I keep telling myself that I'm fortressed out, yet I continue to climb up the mountains to see yet another one. You're almost always guaranteed a fantastic view. This particular one had some interesting coves that allowed people to shoot, yet be protected behind the rock, and they had a lot of canyons that were still in good shape. I stopped at a few more cities, but then decided it was time to move on. I wanted to visit 2 more countries in the Balkans, Albania and Montenegro. I already told you the funny story about how I entered Albania via the cab and the bus and caught the bus on the road after I discovered no buses entered the town during the off-season. So now I am safely tucked in at the capital of Albania, Tirana. Tirana looks like any modern-day city. For some reason, I'm thinking it was going to be backward because it was a little late coming to the modern party. It was a communist satellite state of Russia, unlike the former Yugoslavia, which under communist Tito managed to cleverly straddle the Russians and the West to obtain concessions from both while belonging to neither. After a civil war in 1997, which abolished communism, this developing country sought to model itself after Western countries, and they eventually joined NATO in 2009 and are currently a candidate for the EU since 2014. While the city itself looks fully modern, as mentioned, this is the only country on this trip that I did not drink out of the tap. Also, as mentioned, Albania claims Mother Teresa as hers, and there's a beautiful statue and church honoring her due to her Albanian descent. Albania was true to Stalin and the USSR for years. After the fall of communism, rather than destroy their history and topple statues commemorating Stalin or glorifying communism, they moved them out of the way so it wouldn't traumatize those that lost loved ones or who were tortured or any of the awful things that happened during the war. But they didn't want to erase their history because you're condemned to repeat it if you erase it. So what they did is they moved them to the back of these nondescript parking lots, almost like they were discarded garbage. But when people needed to get the historical lessons, they would be brought to the statues, but they're not in your face when you're touring the city. I thought it was a very clever solution. I also had an interesting afternoon that I spent in the Museum of Secret Surveillance. It was really creepy how even back then how they could spy on everything and know everything to control the people. No telling what our governments can do now. It was very scary. Albania has a long coast along the Adriatic Sea, and if it weren't winter, I probably would have tootled around exploring, but I've already learned that the water towns are all but closed because they're second homes for most people, so it wouldn't be worth it for me. My last Balkan destination before flying to Portugal was Montenegro, and actually I wanted to see if this might be a place I want to retire. I'd heard such wonderful things about it. It's beautiful like Croatia. It's just south of Dubrovnik, but it's not nearly as expensive. However, in recent years, the Russians have been gobbling up the waterfront, so prices have gone up significantly, although it's still pretty affordable. There's hope, too, that it's going to join the EU, and Montenegro is easier and more affordable to get residency than some of the other countries in the EU. So a lot of people are placing a bet that they can get an EU passport by buying a place in Montenegro, another thing that's driving up the prices. At the time of my visit, I had considered living abroad until I got feeble, and then I would move back to the U.S., but I've since decided I really belong in the U.S. In Montenegro, there are several beautiful cities that I visited. I especially like Kotor. There I met a 30-some-odd-year-old American gal who had bought a beautiful waterfront 3-bedroom apartment for like $250,000. She showed it to me and it was really nice. Although it was a bit further walk than the main downtown area, it was pretty darn nice. And the coastline here is gorgeous, and it definitely has its appeal. But after months in the Balkans, I was ready for a change of diet, and I think I did the Balkans proud. I saw a lot, I ate a lot, I went to gobs of museums and fortresses and castles and churches and mosques, and I feel like I have a pretty good understanding, marginally with the history a little bit, but pretty good about the people and the countries. But after months in the Balkans, like I said, I was ready for a change of diet, and I think I vowed not to eat red meat for a year. Although I know I broke that, I had eaten red meat for almost every meal for months and months on end. I have loved my time in this beautiful but very complicated region. I'm glad to see they've mostly recovered from the wars of the 90s. I'm also glad to see they're taking great pains not to forget, so hopefully it will never repeat that evil again. I was there for the fall and winter of 2021, the winter of 22, after Europe had opened up after COVID. And so for me, I had no problem doing last-minute planning of my trip because nobody was traveling then. So I can't say if that was being the off-season because people were still scared to travel. All I know is it was very easy for me to make last-minute plans. And I'm finding, as I'm traveling now, obviously outside of the Balkans, that's getting harder and harder to do because there was so much pent-up demand that double check before you just wing it like I did on that to see how far in advance you need to make reservations. I loved on this trip having total flexibility in my travels, and I encourage you to try traveling that way sometimes, even if you don't do the whole trip. Leave some open white space in your travel plans to allow for serendipity. That's when some of the most exciting, fun things can happen. And that's when I've had the time to spend with the people I've met on the trip. I often meet people on my walking tours. And then we might become half-day friends or full-day friends or Facebook friends. Who knows? But if you have everything so rigidly scheduled, you won't have time for that. I hope in today's show I've opened your eyes to a region of the world not commonly visited by Westerners. There are so few places in the world left where it's not over-touristed. The Balkans are safe, beautiful. They definitely look European. You know you're in Europe. You also get that real cool Turkish vibe going on as well. And it's extraordinarily interesting, particularly for the history buffs. I encourage you to consider a trip to this really, really intriguing region. Be sure to check out tons of photos that I put online at activetraveladventures.com and make sure you're getting the monthly newsletter so you get access to all the travel planners. You can sign up at the website or by emailing me or kit@activetraveladventures.com. I also thank you for using my affiliate links to plan your trips for tours, your stays, and travel insurance, because at no additional cost to you, you're helping to support the program and keeping it ad-free. So I thank you, all the other listeners thank you, and I really, really thank you for listening. Until next time, this is Kit Parks. Adventure on!